There is a moment in a lab in Israel where a scientist stares at a screen and doesn't say anything for almost a full minute. Not because the machine broke, not because the data failed, because the numbers on that screen just did something that 200 years of historians, priests, and colonial officials swore was impossible. They confirmed a story that a small, forgotten community on the coast of India had been whispering to their children for 80 generations. A story about a shipwreck. A story about a lost people. A story everyone else on Earth had already decided was a fantasy. For 200 years, nobody believed them. Not the British, not the Indian scholars, not even some of the other Jewish communities they eventually met. And for 200 years, there was no way to prove otherwise, because the only evidence anyone had was a story passed mouth to mouth. Then geneticists opened a vial of blood. And the blood didn't just settle the argument. It cracked it open in a way nobody expected, revealing something stranger and more human than a simple yes or no. This is the story of the Jews of India. And by the end of it, you're going to understand something about memory itself, about how far the truth can travel through time before it starts to bend, and why that bending doesn't mean the truth was ever a lie. Most people, if you stopped them on the street and asked where Jewish history happened, would say Jerusalem, maybe Babylon, maybe a shtetl in Poland, or a crowded street in old Alexandria. Almost nobody says India. And yet, for well over 1,000 years, maybe close to 2,000, there have been Jewish communities living quietly along India's coastline, lighting Sabbath candles in a country that never once tried to burn them for it. They built synagogues that are still standing. They kept kosher in a nation obsessed with its own food traditions. They prayed in a language none of their neighbors understood. And almost nobody outside those communities could tell you with any real confidence where they had actually come from. There were 4 groups, scattered across 4 different corners of the subcontinent, and each one carried a completely different version of the same impossible claim. The largest of them, the Bene Israel, settled along the Konkan coast, not far from where Mumbai stands today. For most of their history, they had no rabbi, no Torah scroll, no contact with anyone else in the Jewish world. Their neighbors gave them a nickname, Shanwar Teli, the Saturday oil pressers, because they ran oil presses for a living and then, mysteriously, refused to touch the equipment one day out of every 7. They kept circumcision. They kept a version of the Sabbath. They recited a single Hebrew prayer that had survived, word for word, through centuries of isolation, even after they'd forgotten what most of the words meant. Their own story, the one grandmothers told grandchildren by lamplight, was about a disaster. A group of Israelites, fleeing something terrible back in their homeland, boarded a ship that never made it. It broke apart off the Konkan coast. Only a handful of survivors dragged themselves onto the beach, soaked, grieving, with nothing left of the life they'd been living. And from that handful, over the centuries, grew an entire community that forgot almost everything except the fact that they were never supposed to be there in the first place. For centuries after that, nobody came looking for them. And they didn't know how to go looking for anyone else. They raised children, who raised children, who raised children, further and further from whatever their ancestors had actually known, until one day a traveling Jewish merchant passed through their villages and noticed something odd. Women in the market insisting a meal be prepared a certain way. A phrase repeated at dusk that sounded, if you listen closely, almost like Hebrew. He sat with them, he listened, and slowly he came to believe that this community of oil pressers, isolated for who knows how many generations, had been quietly guarding the last embers of something ancient without fully understanding what they were holding on to. Further south, near the city of Cochin, a second and very different community had taken root. The Cochin Jews had what the Bene Israel didn't: synagogues, Torah scrolls, rabbis, a documented, continuous religious life stretching back centuries. And their story reached back even further than the shipwreck tale, all the way to the destruction of the first temple, more than 600 years before the birth of Christ. If that story were literally true, this community would be older than the Roman Empire. A third group lived nowhere near the ocean at all. Up in the hill states near India's border with Myanmar, a community calling itself the Bene Menashe claimed descent from one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, the tribe of Manasseh, scattered by the Assyrian Empire nearly 27 centuries ago. For most of their recorded history, though, this community wasn't practicing anything resembling Judaism. They were animists. Their Israelite identity only surfaced in the 20th century, after a local spiritual leader described a vision instructing them to reclaim a heritage they'd supposedly lost. And then there were the Baghdadi Jews, the one group whose story nobody argued about because it was written down. Ship manifests, merchant ledgers, colonial paperwork. They arrived from Iraq, from Syria, from Yemen in the 18th and 19th centuries, following trade routes across the Persian Gulf. Nobody doubted where they came from. And it turns out that certainty would end up being useful for an entirely different reason than anyone expected. 4 communities, 4 stories about where they came from. And for 2 centuries, not one of those stories could be proven or disproven using anything historians actually had access to. Linguists dug for old loanwords and found scraps too thin to build a case on. Colonial ethnographers compared rituals and walked away with contradictory theories. Religious scholars argued from scripture and never landed on the same page twice. Every method available before the era of genetic science required, in the end, simply taking somebody's word for it. And nobody fully trusted anybody's word, not even, sometimes, their own. So the question sat there, unanswered, for 200 years, until someone stopped asking historians and started asking DNA. Here's the thing about your genome that most people never think about. It's not just instructions for building a body. It's an archive, a biological record that doesn't need a surviving manuscript or an unbroken memory to hold up across 80 generations, because it's carried, physically, inside every cell of every descendant, whether they know their own history or not. 2 threads inside that archive turned out to be especially useful. The Y chromosome, passed almost unchanged from father to son, carries a record stretching back thousands of years, broken only by the slow, steady drip of mutation. Mitochondrial DNA does the same thing down the maternal line, mother to child, generation after generation. Because these mutations accumulate at a roughly predictable pace, scientists can use them almost like a clock. Not a perfect one, but a clock that can tell you, with real statistical confidence, roughly how long ago 2 populations shared a common ancestor. Researchers group these mutations into clusters called haplogroups, and certain haplogroups show up again and again in specific parts of the world, a fingerprint left behind by tens of thousands of years of migration, settlement, and intermarriage. When a haplogroup that belongs to one region of the world suddenly shows up at unusually high frequency inside a population living somewhere completely different, that's not static. That's a signal, one that can actually be measured, dated, and set side by side with the community's own oral history to see if the 2 stories match. In 2016, a team from Tel Aviv University, Cornell, and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine finally ran that exact test on the Bene Israel. 18 community members, genomes compared against hundreds of other Jewish, Indian, and Pakistani populations, and a separate, larger study, published around the same time in the journal Scientific Reports, widened the lens to look at the genetic history of Indian Jewish communities as a whole. Here's where it gets interesting, because the answer they found wasn't a clean yes or a clean no. It was something far stranger. On the paternal side, the picture was unmistakable. Indian Jewish populations carried 2 distinct genetic signatures layered on top of each other. One was purely South Asian, the same lineage found across the general Indian population. But sitting right alongside it was a second smaller cluster of haplogroups tied specifically to the Middle East, to the exact region their oral histories pointed to. This alone killed one of the 2 simplest theories on the table. If the Bene Israel and Cochin Jews were nothing but local converts who had adopted Jewish customs with zero ancestral connection to the ancient Near East, their Y chromosomes would look identical to their non-Jewish neighbors. They don't. There is a real, measurable, paternally inherited thread running straight back to the Levant. But then came the part of the data that complicates the story most people want to tell. Because when the researchers calculated exactly when that Middle Eastern ancestry mixed into the local population, the numbers didn't match the legend, not even close. The Cochin Jewish community's genetic signal pointed to a founding event more than 1,500 years ago. Impressive, but nowhere near the 25 centuries their oral tradition claims, the story that ties them all the way back to the fall of the First Temple. And the Bene Israel signal was even more recent, landing somewhere around 1,000 years ago, roughly a full millennium after the ancient shipwreck their grandmothers had been describing for generations. Sit with that for a second. Imagine being told, after a lifetime of believing your family's founding myth down to the specific century, that the myth was right about almost everything except when it happened. That the shape of the story survived perfectly across 2,000 years of retelling, but the date drifted, quietly, slowly pulled backward, generation after generation, toward the most dramatic and sacred moments in Jewish history, because a story about surviving the destruction of the temple simply feels more meaningful than a story about a smaller, quieter migration 1,000 years later. That's not a failure of memory. That's what memory does to every story it's asked to carry for too long. There's a second layer to this that goes even deeper than dates. When researchers plotted these populations using something called principal component analysis, essentially a genetic map built from thousands of individual markers, three distinct clusters appeared. The Bene Israel and Cochin Jews did not simply blend into the surrounding Indian population, the way you'd expect if their Jewish identity were nothing but a cultural costume with no ancestry behind it. But they also didn't sit directly on top of Ashkenazi Jews or other diaspora communities either. They occupied their own space in between, pulled toward the broader Jewish world on one side and toward the Indian subcontinent on the other, anchored right in the middle. Exactly the pattern you'd expect from a small number of Middle Eastern men arriving, marrying local women, and then having their descendants marry almost exclusively within the community their fathers built, generation after generation, for 1,000 years. And this is where the Baghdadi Jews, the community with the boring, fully documented history, turned out to be scientifically priceless. Because their arrival in India happened only 200 or 300 years ago, researchers could use their genetic profile as a kind of before picture, and their DNA closely mirrors Jewish communities still living in the Middle East today. Almost no South Asian ancestry mixed in yet. In other words, the Baghdadi Jews show us exactly what the Bene Israel and Cochin communities probably looked like genetically in their own first few generations on Indian soil, before 1,000 years of intermarriage slowly reshaped them into something new. Now here's the part of this story that doesn't resolve the way you want it to. The Bene Menashe, up in the hills near Myanmar, went through the exact same genetic testing, and the results came back with nothing. No Middle Eastern signal, no trace of the ancient Near East anywhere in their paternal or maternal lines. Their DNA aligns almost entirely with the Tibeto-Burman populations native to that region, the same populations they themselves emerged from, culturally and linguistically, before their religious transformation in the 20th century. Genetically speaking, there is no measurable connection to the lost tribe of Manasseh at all. And yet, in 2005, Israel's Sephardic chief rabbi issued a formal ruling recognizing the Bnei Menashe as descendants of that lost tribe. A ruling that opened the door for thousands of them to immigrate to Israel. Science said no. Religious law said yes. And both of those answers are still standing today, because Jewish identity under Jewish law has never rested purely on bloodline in the first place. Conversion has always been a legitimate path in, regardless of what a laboratory would find if you drew blood. So what do you do with a story like this? A story where two communities turn out to be exactly as ancient as they claim to be, just not exactly on the timeline they remembered. And a third community turns out to have almost no genetic connection at all, yet is recognized as fully Jewish anyway, on different grounds entirely. You do what any honest person does. You sit with the discomfort of it. Because the neat version, the version where science simply proves an old legend true or false, was never actually available to us. What we got instead was messier, and honestly more moving. The skeptics who dismissed the Bene Israel's shipwreck story as pure invention were wrong. There really was a small group of ancestors from the Middle East sitting at the root of that family tree. But the elders who insisted the story was accurate down to the century were also, in a narrower sense, mistaken. The migration was real. The date was off by 1,000 years. Somehow, across 2,000 years of being carried by nothing but human voice and human memory, the shape of the truth survived even as the precise timing slipped. The fact of a journey, the fact of a founding, the fact of a homeland left behind, all of it held, even while the calendar attached to it quietly drifted toward the most sacred date anyone could imagine. That is not a community lying to itself for 2 millennia. That is what happens when something true gets old enough to start dreaming a little. And maybe that's the part of this story that reaches past India entirely, because there are communities scattered across the whole world right now, carrying stories about lost homelands and ancient migrations that no historian has ever been able to confirm or dismiss with any real confidence. For most of human history, those stories just sat there, unresolved, waiting. Genetics has started to change that, quietly, one vial of blood at a time. Not by handing down a verdict from on high, but by listening to something every single one of us carries inside our own cells. An unbroken record reaching back through every ancestor who ever lived long enough to have a child of their own. That record doesn't care which version of the story feels more comfortable. It doesn't care about the drama of a destroyed temple or the simplicity of a shipwreck. It just sits there, patiently, recording exactly what happened, generation after generation, waiting for someone with the right tools to finally come along and read it. Think about what that actually means for a second. Somewhere in a household on the Konkan coast, an old woman lit a lamp on a Friday evening and murmured a prayer whose meaning she could no longer fully explain because it had been handed to her by a mother who had received it the exact same way, empty of translation but full of instruction. Do this, don't ask why, just do this. She had no idea that 1,000 years earlier, a man who looked nothing like her, who spoke a language she couldn't have understood, who came from a world that no longer existed by the time she was born, was the reason her hands moved the way they did over that flame. She wasn't performing a metaphor. She was running a program written into her family 100 generations before microscopes existed to read it back. That's the part that should actually stop you, not the science. The fact that it took a laboratory in the 21st century to finally give an old woman's grandmother the credit she was owed the entire time. Somewhere on the Konkan coast tonight, there are still families who light candles on a Friday evening the way their ancestors did before anyone had a name for genetics, before anyone had a machine that could read a chromosome. They don't need the science to know who they are. They already knew. The blood just finally caught up to the story. And maybe that's the last thing worth sitting with, once the cameras stop and the numbers on the screen fade back to black. Somewhere between a shipwreck nobody wrote down and a laboratory result nobody expected, an entire people spent 2,000 years being right about who they were and wrong about almost nothing that mattered. The door on this one doesn't close with an answer. It closes with the quiet sound of a story finally being believed.